Life Stories.
Worldwide for another story, another wonderful story. Tonight, this story is going to come from Scotland. But let me tell you, please encourage your friends to watch tonight on Zoom or Facebook or YouTube. It's live on all those. And if you have any requests, any needs, please contact us on our prayer hotline. You can see the number on your screen at 07943 550 287. If you're outside the UK, then you'll need to put +44 in front of that number. If you also could go to our website, LifeStoriesWorldwide.com, you'll find out more information about the work that's going on. Please do that. Please contact us on that website. So tonight, as I say, we've got Stuart Patterson, who's going to share his story. He got held up a little bit in traffic, so he's a little bit late, but he's here, and that's the most important thing. Stuart was born and raised in a very tough area of Glasgow in Scotland, and his life was not conventional. He was a life that offered so much, but it didn't go that way. He was robbed of all sorts of things, of promise and hope, and affected many people's lives, causing a lot of sorrow, a lot of heartache to people. But then in 1997, in May, something happened which changed it, and he's going to share that tonight. So right now, I'm going to hand over to you, Stuart, to share your story. Thank you, Stuart.
I'm going to take the opportunity, though. One of the great things that happened as a consequence of my faith was that access to the throne on behalf of others. And I think it would be right for me as a minister to take this opportunity with Businessmen's Fellowship, just that we lift up Mark Hind, who heads up Open Doors in Scotland in prayer, who is suffering, is actually taking a turn for the worse, is in hospital with COVID and suspected meningitis, and is really, really ill. And we uphold him in prayer for a real work of God in his life. It's one of the things that happened when I didn't know how to pray for myself. I was dependent upon the prayers for others. And so thank you for allowing me to take that liberty. My name is Stuart. I'm from a place called Easterhouse in Glasgow. I was born into an average Easterhouse family, in the sense I had a mum, I had a dad. There was 5 brothers and a sister, although there was a 10-year gap between the youngest and the second youngest brother. I came in the middle of the boys. I was apparently intelligent, but not very academic. That'll make sense in itself. Also not very clever. You can be intelligent but be stupid at the same time. You know, you need to be able to apply that. But I was also very much a loner my whole life. I never really knew how to relate to people. I really struggled and found myself isolated even in crowds as I was growing up. But through having a mum who was determined to press ahead and get the best, I ended up getting a bursary for Hutcheson's Grammar School, which is one of the best fee-paying schools in Scotland, definitely in Glasgow. And it wasn't until I entered into first year in Hutcheson's that I realised that coming from a place like Easterhouse, that we never had what other people had. That is the sort of financial, I say prosperity, but you know what I mean, the benefit and the comfort that can bring. I became, at the age of 11, very insecure about where I was from. I used to lie about the type of housing and everything that I lived in, and was not because anybody tried to, but very ashamed of the lack that I seemed to have compared to what the other students seemed to have. Years to come, it would find out that some of those students were going through the same struggles as me. But as we do in life, we tend to allow our issues, our troubles, to isolate us from actually the help and the support that is available. But I left Hutcheson's at the start of third year. I'd already become involved in the gang fighting and the drugs, which is very much part of Easterhouse life. Easterhouse was very territorial in the 80s where I grew up. And I was part of one of the gangs. I was part of them because it was just a bunch of local guys from our area that I could hang out with, that there was no judgmentalism coming from, nothing like that. But I would smoke a little bit of cannabis and drink a little bit of wine just to fit in with them. Not much, just enough that I would fit in with them. But it was enough where I stopped going to school. The reason I stopped going was because I didn't have the money for a book that I needed. So rather than confess, the book, funnily enough, was Of Mice and Men. Rather than confess to my mum and dad that I needed this book, I had worked up the courage one day to tell my mum I needed it. We didn't have Amazon. We didn't have next day delivery in 1983. I remember working up the courage all the way home from Pollokshields to Easterhouse, and working up the courage, going up the steps and really building up to get in and say to my mum, I really need this book for next week. And as I walked in the door, my mum and dad were actually arguing, and they were arguing over money. And so that did it for me. That was it. There was no way I was mentioning it. So the next Friday, when I was due to go to an English class, I got to Glasgow Central Station, bank of phones, and I phoned the school and pretended I was my dad. Now, my voice hadn't dropped or anything at that point, but nobody's expecting a 13-year-old boy to phone and pretend he's his dad. Definitely not at Hutchison's, and made an excuse for not going to school. And I did that for the next 6 weeks, and I got away with it. Nobody seemed to be aware of what was going on. And I ended up where I used to take a bag of change with me. Instead of a big bag of books, it ended up I had a change of clothes, and I would get changed in Glasgow Central, but I would do the underground. I would go on the Clockwork Orange, and all that time, the only person that ever stopped this very young, I mean, I was very, very small at 13. I was something, one of my nicknames was Titch. I was so small compared to my peers, was a subway conductor who asked me one day, aren't you supposed to be in school? And that was the only challenge I got. But life, as you can imagine, got worse and worse. I started to distance myself more and more from school, to the point that I did leave at the start of third year. But because I was more scared of my mum than I was the other gangs, I ended up going to another comprehensive in Easterhouse, but in a different area where one of the other gangs, our main enemies, sort of ran the rule. And I'll never forget that I used to, every single day when the bell rang, I would make my way down and run out the girls' doors. There was girls' doors and there was boys' doors, and the other gang used to always hang outside the boys' doors. They never ever figured that I would run out the girls. And I used to have to run out the girls' doors and get across what we called the arena, which was a rugby pitch, which in Easterhouse was kind of unusual because none of us played rugby, and get across to my gang side. This continued for a year till it got to the point where the police had to stand outside the gate to make sure I get out of school safely. But in all of this time, no one ever came and asked me what was going on in my life. Many, many people would come along and tell me what was wrong in my life, but nobody ever actually spoke to me and looked for reasoning from me. And I remember that, I'm not sure that I would have spoken up, but I do remember, and I really struggled with that right through my teens and my young adulthood as life got worse and addiction got worse. At the age of 15, I was in my third secondary school, the one my mum didn't want me to go to. Because my birthday's in February, it meant I couldn't leave school till Christmas in fifth year. And I remember one day sitting in geography class in what was Westwood Secondary School then, thinking, oh, I can leave. And that was it. I never went back to school. So the promise that I had, I used to, when I was sharing my testimony, say, at the age of 14, I was going to be a lawyer. I had the means through Hutchison's, I had the support through the family, and even had the good friends to do it. But by the time I was 15, I was a YTS butcher. I don't know if you remember the YTS schemes, £27.30 a week for doing more work than my friend who was on an apprenticeship. But that was it, before my 16th birthday. Also before my 16th birthday, I'd fallen in love with my first drug, which was acid, LSD, and the circumstances surrounding that. And I would take as many as I could get my hands on. And I also found out that in taking them, you had to get these from one of the other gang areas. And I found out, if I'm fighting these guys, then I can't get the drugs. And I was one of the first people in Easterhouse to begin to break down the gang barrier, because I realized that getting drugs was more important than getting battered. I was never a good fighter. And I very quickly got involved in selling drugs, not to any great extent, but I enjoyed the lifestyle of it. It's kind of weird to describe, but addiction is not just about getting stoned. It's as much about the lifestyle, which is a 24/7 lifestyle that is full of purpose. As much and demonic as that purpose is, I was very caught up in it. At the age of 18, I was injecting, people would say, what were you injecting? Well, whatever I could put into a needle and put into my arms, I was taking. Mostly amphetamine sulfate in these little tablets called Tangesics. I was arrested at that time and I was charged with being concerned with the intent to supply. Had a small quantity of drugs on me, but it meant I had my first spell in prison. It was only a couple of weeks. I went to Polmont Young Offenders Institution, and at 19 I was sentenced, and I got a D category, which meant I went to an open prison. Now, while all this was going on, I was still a deep thinker. My lifestyle had taken over me and it had controlled me. And my only controlling thought was, how do I get my next fix? For me as an addict, my whole life had been condensed down into that very thought. So even say in a chat like this, a group this size, I would be in this conversation and my brain would be working around the objective of how do I get money for a fix from this conversation? And it wouldn't matter what you were telling me. And that's why when I did try and write into a book my story, it was called Completing the Tenner. Because by the time I was on heroin was £10 a bag. And my every conversation had to be about completing that £10 for my next bag of heroin. When I went to prison, it was a young offenders institution. One of the first things they did was hand me the key to my room. It was Castle Huntly. It's now a cons prison. But being handed the key to my room and being 4 weeks into my sentence, I remember going to Dens Park to watch Celtic play in Dundee. I am a Celtic fan, but I remember being bemused by that. We were put into the disabled section as people from Easterhouse that I knew would pass cannabis to me through the fence, separating the disabled fans from the visiting fans. And I remember being bemused and thinking, I'm supposed to be being punished at this moment in time. You know, so my mind was going through some strange things. They make you do IQ tests and all that when you're going in prison as part of the assessment. And I remember in Pullman, the guy that had done it, that was over it, came up and speaking to me and telling me that my IQ was quite high and asking me what I was doing in prison. So I told them I'm in prison because I got caught, you know, but they never did anything with that. There was no personalisation. There was no sense of rehabilitation. Most of the classes that were in Castle Huntly were aimed at as if you had little or no academic ability. There was no real challenging, you know, and if there was no sense of capturing who I was, and I wasn't the only one in there that was quite an intelligent person, that if it had been captured, I know that had been captured and properly rehabilitated, might have benefited from it. In fact, after spending 12 months in prison, the last words I heard spoken over me were, "See you soon," by the prison officer as I left prison. Now, as we will find out in a few minutes, my life has progressed. I'm actually a university student just now. And I'm actually part of trying to campaign that prison officers are banned from saying that. It is not their right to speak a curse over someone who has actually finished their custodial sentence, no matter what. But for me as a 20-year-old now at that point, that was the last thing I heard leaving prison, "See you soon." And I says, "No, you won't." And I never ended up back in prison, but that was just because I was too clever to get caught. The drugs got worse, my involvement got worse, the gangs got worse. And I did methadone twice. The first time I did methadone because I found out if I said the right words to my drug counsellor, then he would tell my doctor to give me drugs. I was an addict and it was free drugs. So I took them and I sold them. I ended up working as a building site security guard because that meant 15 and a half hours on a building site on my own, not having to deal with people. At that point in my life, I didn't want to be around people. I hated people because people reminded me how far I had fallen from the promise that I knew my life was supposed to contain. So building site security work suited me, but that ended up being overcome by a lot of the Glasgow gangsters.
Stories.
The second time I did methadone, I think, round about 25, not sure when. My whole 20s up until I went to Teen Challenge are a bit of a blur. But the second time I did it, I was serious. I was started on 80 mil of methadone, and I was detoxed down 5 mil a fortnight every 2 weeks. That's the recommended safe detox level, down to taking 2 mil. Now, 2 mil, when I'm in Easterhouse Health Centre, was put into a funnel so that it would seem more. And for 2 weeks, I took that 2 mil as well. But can I tell you, I was as addicted on the 2 mil as I was on the 80, because nobody was preparing me for life beyond addiction. Nobody had handed me something that gave my life the meaning and purpose. As sad as it sounds, addiction gave it. And I remember phoning my counsellor the day I took my last dose of methadone, asking what's next. And he says, what do you mean? I says, well, for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 10 years, my life has revolved around my next fix. What do I do now? He had no answer for me. So I went to the nearest heroin dealer and took a bag of heroin after being basically drug-free other than methadone for 10 months. Nobody had offered me anything, any hope or something worth living for. 2 years later, one of the companies I was working for, the guys thought they were gangsters. I get took out to a building site. There was a gun stuck in my back. The trigger was pulled and the gun jammed. And I've been asked, how do you know that there was bullets in the gun? Well, I was 27-year-old. I was sitting in a car in a field outside Lindsay. I wasn't going to ask him if there was any bullets in the gun. I just took his word for it. And it was through quite a ridiculous set of circumstances that weekend. I quit my job on the Saturday. Always a good thing to do if your boss wants to kill you. Get out of there. On the Sunday, I remember taking Valium instead of heroin for the first time in years. And I remember making all the promises to my mum that I'd done year after year after year. Yeah, this time I'm serious, Mum, I've had enough. An addict will see and do whatever they can to get through the moment and get a fix. They are 100% serious about stopping drugs, but also 100% serious about getting the next fix. And that was a bit of both, but I'll never forget, 9:30 the next morning, my mum came in to get me and she says, right, come on. I said, what do you mean? Phone your counsellor. And so I had been caught out. She wasn't letting me away with it. But what did happen was I couldn't get my counsellor on the phone 9:30 on a Monday morning, but she went next door. We lived in a tenement block. And actually next door happened to be one of my lifelong friends, Jim Fitzgerald, who sadly passed away in his early 40s. And his mum, he lived with his mum. But they got the number of a pastor that was involved with a ministry called Teen Challenge. For those of you that don't know Teen Challenge, it was started by a 25-year-old American pastor who never knew any better but to go to a court and tell a judge that 7 guys accused of a gang murder, if they knew God through Christ, their lives could be different. And through that narrative, Teen Challenge is now in over 100 countries worldwide. But I was an addict. I didn't know anything about that. My mum got this guy to come out and see me. Pastor Ken Persad, his name is. He's now the pastor of Notting Hill Community Church in London. But at that point, he pastored in Castlemilk. And so I says all the right words. I did all the right things. I did what I had to do because I was hoping this guy would tell my mum to give me a tenner so I could go and get drugs. And Ken promised that he would get me into rehab within a week. But apparently the process for Teen Challenge, even at that time, was you had to visit the bus. I never went near the Teen Challenge bus that came into Easterhouse. I thought Christians were head cases and psychopaths, and I couldn't believe any of my friends that would go on the bus looking for help. You know, I used to mock and scorn, despite the state I was in, hair away out there, beard away out there, my complexion and my countenance totally, the worst that you could imagine as it was. And here I would look down my nose at those offering help. But I remember that night I was going through a sort of physical, mental craving, not a physical, a mental craving. And I remember being very, very agitated. My mum saying, well, I phoned that guy who was out today. Now, my addict brain goes into sat-nav mode, which is, how do I turn this into £10? So I was like, yeah. And I thought, if she phones him, he'll tell her that he's going to get him into rehab. And then he'll tell her to give me £10 just to get me through. And apparently, according to Ken, I'm not on the phone and I did all the usual moaning and whinging and crying and whining and trying to manipulate the circumstances. But Ken offered to pray for me. And I can't tell you the words he said, but I can tell you on that night in May 1997, I said, thank you, put the phone down, walked into my sitting room. My sister, my mum and my dad were sitting there. I looked at them and I said, I'm sorry. Now, I'm unaware that I've stopped looking for drugs at this point. I'm just aware that I walked in and said sorry. My dad says, heard it all before. But my mum, I'll never forget, my mum said, no, look at him. He's different. Now, as I said, I didn't look different. I didn't feel different. I wasn't aware personally of any difference. But an hour later, she insisted I go and phone Ken back and tell him that I was okay. And I didn't understand why I would have to phone him again so quickly. It was 20 years later, Ken and I had the conversation that was such was the difference within an hour in who I was. Nobody had spoke the gospel to me or nothing. Ken just prayed, which is why I opened with saying about praying for Mark Hind. Because in that moment, somebody chose to pray for me rather than preach at me, rather than counsel me or any of those other measures. He chose to pray. And that was a Monday. On the Thursday, I went to the Haven. Fantastic guy called Finn was the manager there. My introduction to Teen Challenge Ministry was, Stuart, you're no longer a junkie. You're no longer an addict. You're now a student. It says you're not a Christian because you've not chosen to be one, but you're now a student. You're here to learn the Bible, the Word of God, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whether you like it or not. I thought he was exaggerating. I was about to find out different. Now, the Haven's based in Kilmacombe, and I am so grateful that I still have a very good relationship with the management and the students there. But this was 24 years ago. And Finn then said, I had a place to go to in their centre, their men's centre, which was in Wales at the time. And I remember Finn saying to me, we're going to keep you here for induction. That's the first 4 weeks. And I remember actually turning around and saying, no, you're not. I have a place in Wales. If I don't go there, the first time it gets hard, I'll be up the road. For those of you not from Glasgow, what that means is I'm going straight home. So there was this back and forward conversation. So the next conversation with Finn was, he says, okay, you're going to Wales tomorrow. Do you have the bus fare? Now, I started laughing at that. I was a drug addict that got myself in that situation by trying to get £10 for a bag of heroin. And here he's asking me if I have £60 for a bus to Wales. So my good friend, Roy Lees, who I didn't really know at that time, but Roy started the bus ministries. Roy paid for my fare to go down to Wales on the Friday. I had my last cigarette in a taxi from the bus station in Swansea to a converted supermarket in South Wales. I walked through the back door of the men's centre there at 12:30 on the Friday night on the 23rd of May, 1997, a week to the minute after that guy stuck the gun in my back. Now, why have I spent so much on that part of my story without moving into what Christ has done? Because for me, it's very, very important for setting the context. Not just that I was an addict, but that God was already working and directing and guiding my steps before I was even aware of who God was. God was already working miracles in my life before I was aware of a Christ who died for me. So if wherever or however you're listening into this conversation, whether you're there because you've known Jesus your whole life, or you're here because somebody forced you to listen, can I tell you, you're here because God is already ordaining your steps so that you can receive hope. But back to my story. I get into this program. The Saturday morning, you have what they call quiet time, which in Teen Challenge language means you're handed a Bible and 15 minutes on a sofa. I didn't know what to do with that. And if I asked anybody, what do I do with this? I was told to shut up because it was quiet time and you would get a white ticket if you spoke during it. I actually know now that it's about learning to devote some time in the morning to just sit and talking to God or allowing God to speak to you and, meditate and think about his word and allow his word to speak strength to you. I never knew any of that then. The Sunday I went to Swansea Elam, Pastor Phil Hills, who is the general manager, chief executive of Teen Challenge now, was the chairman there. Can't tell you anything about the Sunday morning. Can't remember a thing about it. The Sunday evening, I think I slept all the way through it, bearing in mind my body that is usually up all night is now adjusting to having to get up at 7:30 in the morning and go to bed at 10:30 at night. My world had been turned upside down. But I remember as Pastor Phil gave an altar call for the gospel that night, even though I never understood what the gospel was, my heart was thumping and I wanted to respond. There was something in me desperate to connect with whatever it was that was going on in Swansea City Elim Church that night. Didn't understand it, couldn't make any sense of it, but I knew I needed to respond, and the staff wouldn't let me. They says, no, it was 2 intern staff members. I still think I'm the only Teen Challenge student in the history of Teen Challenge that wasn't allowed to respond to what we call an altar call. But I went back to the centre, and Pastor Robert Hughes, who was the manager, a lovely, one of the gentlest and godliest men I've ever had the privilege of knowing, was on duty that night, and I went back and I sat with him, and he asked me if I wanted to pray a prayer of salvation. Now, bearing in mind, I was very, very wary of prayer when he said that word prayer. There's a part of me that's thinking, wait a minute, somebody prayed for me on Monday, and I've ended up sitting in a converted supermarket in South Wales on Sunday. But there was the other part of me that I don't understand prayer. I don't know what to say. I just know that I need to respond. So he says, I tell you what, I'll say some words, you repeat them. And can I say it wasn't about the words, the confession that I spoke, because I didn't understand it, but it was about verbalizing a connection to God and understanding my need of God, understanding that all that trying to work myself out of addiction got me deeper into addiction, couldn't go on anymore. And this God of love had actually not just stepped into my life, but invaded my life. He had made himself gloriously known. And I'm reminded in Acts chapter 7, I was speaking about this last night, when Stephen, whose role is to serve food, begins to preach the gospel, he talks about the God of glory. And that's what happened that night. It wasn't that angels descended in the room. It wasn't that, there was this marvelous outbreak of light or that Jesus Christ appeared himself. The only thing physical that happened was how I looked at life changed in an instant. All of a sudden, I was aware that I was part of something much bigger than me. I remember running upstairs and telling the students, guys, I've just became a Christian. And they all sort of sniggered and laughed and says, yeah, everybody does that. But I knew something had changed. I knew something was different. And wouldn't it be great to tell you that the past 24 years has been absolutely glorious? The first 2 weeks was miserable. It was like walking through the valley.
Life Stories.